The Holy Gospel according to St. John, the 2nd chapter. Glory to you, Lord. The Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and the money changers seated at the tables. Making a whip of cords, he drove all of them out of the temple, both the sheep and the cattle. He also poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. He told those who were selling the doves, "Take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." The Jews then said to him, "What sign can you show us for doing this?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said to him, "This temple has been under construction for 46 years. And you will raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking of the temple of his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the Scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. The Gospel of the Lord. So lately, in our world, there's been a lot of talk about disruption. And what's meant by disruption is that an idea or a technology or a new way of doing something radically changes how we live or function in our society. And so people have talked about how the internet has disrupted how we receive and process information. They talk about how Amazon has disrupted how we shop and buy things. Car manufacturers are starting to talk about how electric vehicles are disrupting the auto industry. In fact, there have always been things disrupting society. The ones that are fun to think about and study are the ones that happened in the past, because we don't got to live through them. So it is the case that the invention of the printing press was every bit as disruptive in the Middle Ages as the internet is today. The Industrial Revolution was so disruptive it caused riots, and people ran around and thought maybe they could stop this by breaking all the machinery. And some things that we just take for granted today as standard safety kinds of things were once so disruptive. There were warnings about how bad this could possibly be. Some time ago I was researching something, and you know, AAA always issues these distracted driving warnings. They said certain things could cause you to drive and be distracted. So cell phones is the latest thing, and if you have Bluetooth devices, is that just as bad? You know, the very first distracted driving warning that AAA ever issued was about windshield wipers. This newfangled invention that, you know, went in front of your face, and they thought, oh my gosh, because disruptions are like that. Disruptions are both exciting and they can be scary. They present both new possibilities and opportunities, as well as challenges to the way people live. And lately, those disruptions seem to be happening at a faster and faster pace. Yet true disruption, in this sense of the word, is never destruction. Instead, it's supposed to be a way to make things better, to make things different, more accessible to people. Amazon is really not trying to destroy shopping. They're just trying to get you to shop in a different way. The internet, for all its fake news, has not actually destroyed things. It's actually given, well, it has, but it's also given people who didn't have access to information or a voice to chime in, access in ways that they never would before. And you know, auto execs are not getting on board with electric vehicles because they think it's going to destroy the auto industry. They think that they see real possibility and potential there. But disruption, any kind of disruption, as it begins, is often scary. As disruption begins, it's hard to differentiate it from just another big mess that's happening in our lives. And as disruption begins, it necessarily threatens the ways that we have been accustomed to doing things, even if we recognize that some of the ways that we're doing things, well, they really need to change. Even so, changing makes life kind of squirrely. You know, you just watch what happens when they change the operating system and they move things on the menu around and how much that causes people to, because it's disruption. And so I think it's important for us to understand in today's gospel reading this scene that we sometimes call Jesus cleansing the temple, that what Jesus is doing is more than just having a bad day, because that's sometimes the way we read it. Instead, Jesus is being intentionally disruptive in the sense of he's trying to change things. He's trying to alert people to the need to live in a new and a different way. That is, he's not just making a mess and ticking people off. He's asking people to consider what the center of the temple is really all about. And in so doing, he's asking them to consider what their relationship with God is really all about. And like any disruptive process, Jesus isn't trying to destroy either the temple or the worship that goes on in the temple. Instead, he was challenging a routine that had for many people become the goal of going to the temple instead of the means by which worship was empowered. So a lot of people read this story and they think, my gosh, this is like Jesus goes up to go to church and instead he finds a perpetual yard sale going on out front, which is sort of what was going on. When it says Jesus went into the temple, it wasn't actually inside the building. He went up onto the Temple Mount, which is several football fields large, in which people sold animals that could be offered as sacrifice inside the temple, and in which people could change money, which was important because people's money was all Roman coins, and Roman coins had the image of the emperor. Remember the first reading of the Ten Commandments, no graven images in the temple? So you had to change the money so that you could actually pay for things and make the offering to the temple. So the things that were set up there so that it was a convenience, so that if you were coming from 500 miles away on foot, you weren't having to haul your goat along with you to offer that sacrifice, and you weren't having to wonder where in Jerusalem there's an ATM machine so that you can get the right kind of cash to go and make the offering when you get to the temple. And that was all there. It was supposed to be there so that when you got to the temple, you didn't have to worry about those things, so that you could focus on God and your relationship with God and about being part of God's people. But for a lot of people, they just got so caught up in that routine that the routine itself had become the point. And Jesus was disrupting the routine so that people could consider that, you know what? This isn't what it's about. This is supposed to help me open myself to what it's really all about. And what it's really all about is my relationship with God. It's supposed to be a house of prayer, not just a house of yard sale. And Jesus disrupted that routine. But Jesus was also challenging and disrupting people's attitudes about the routine. Because a lot of people have this attitude that, as long as you went up to the temple and you did the sacrifice and you did what you were supposed to do, somehow the routine, the system, the priests, they would all take care of it for you. I went and I did my thing, and I don't have to think about my relationship with God. I don't have to invest myself in my relationship with God. It's all taken care of, and I can go home, and I can be happy, and never having had an actual living relationship with God. And that was never what the temple was supposed to be about. That was never the official line. But people figured that as long as they had the right routine, because maybe you're right, Jesus, the routine has to get shifted a little bit, but once I find the right routine, I just do the routine, and I don't have to invest myself in. And that was the attitude that Jesus was disrupting that day in the temple. Jesus was also disrupting a way of thinking that things can just go on like this forever. Not unlike folks in any age who figure we've learned a way of doing something, we're good at it, and we're just going to keep doing it forever and ever and ever, and it will work like this forever until it doesn't anymore. People were really impressed when they got to Jerusalem and they saw the temple. And they saw, man, this is big, this is huge, I can't imagine how this can ever not be here, how we can ever not make this thing the center of our relationship with God. It was impressive. There were huge stones today. If you go there, if you see pictures of the Wailing Wall, or what's called the Western Wall, that's actually the retaining wall of the mound of the temple. And those are built from 40-ton stones that somehow they were able to carve and move without hydraulics and put together in a way that you can't barely stick a piece of paper between them. It's still impressive to engineers, and people went and they said, boy, this is really impressive. This is always going to be like this. And Jesus is saying, you know what? If you have invested your relationship with God into a building, into a place, and you cannot and do not think about how it is that that relationship could grow and change if you didn't have this thing, then you need to have that disrupted. And that's what Jesus was doing, because he probably knew that 40 years after this event, the temple was destroyed by the Romans. It was knocked down and it wasn't there anymore. And people had to figure out a new way of deepening their relationship with God. We live in a time and a place in which there has been a lot of disruption in our lives. Some of the disruption is really good for us and ultimately good for our society, even if it's uncomfortable. But some of the disruption, it just seems like stuff that's making a big mess in our lives. I mean, we all had a big windstorm come through here, ripped things off our roof, knocked down trees, took out our power, and it's just a big mess. So how do you differentiate between something that's disruptive in a healthy sense and something that just makes a big mess in your life? And at moments like that, it can be really tempting to just say, you know what, I'm going to try to avoid disruption of any kind if I can all manage to make that happen. And while Jesus is only said to have disrupted the temple one time, Jesus was and continues to be calling us to consider that sometimes the disruptions that end up hitting our lives are disruptions that God is intentionally making to try to draw us back into a closer relationship with Him. Sometimes Jesus is asking us what kind of disruptions we're going to make in order to make sure that we are not people who are simply going through the routines of religion. And so part of what this story calls us to do is to consider how Jesus is asking us to think about a challenge to consider disruption of routines that may have become ends in and of themselves instead of patterns that help us grow in faith and in hope and in connection to God. So last year I was leading the congregation for a series of discussions about why. I just called them why. Why do we come to church? Why do we gather together? Why is it that Jesus wants us to be part of a community? And sometimes people looked at me like, well, people look at me and go, oh, well, all the time, but sometimes people looked at me and wondered about that. Well, these are questions, we shouldn't even have to ask, but the reason we have to ask them is sometimes we get caught up in routines that maybe are good. I come to church every week. I always come to church every week and things like that. But if it just becomes routine, it ends up doing the same thing as those sacrifices in the temple. I just come and I do it, and that's supposed to be good in and of itself. And is the routine still doing for me what it should be doing? Is it helping me to connect more deeply with God? Is it helping me to grow in faith? Is it giving me a sense of God's presence and hope in my life? And if it's not, maybe the routine needs to be disrupted. That's the kind of disruption that Jesus calls us to. Jesus is also calling us to think about and challenge our own attitudes about those routines. Because sometimes people get in the rut of thinking, well, you know what, you're right, some of those routines aren't working, I'll just change the routine. And the routine itself, well, that'll be fine. And we'll trust that the routines we got going in church, whether it's the programs, whether it's the people, the pastors, whatever, they'll just take care of it for us. And part of what Jesus is calling us to do is to disrupt the routine enough to be able to consider, what is it that really helps me connect more deeply to God? What is it that helps me feel the presence of God in my life? So part of what we do in Lent, when we ask people to do things like, you know what, try walking the labyrinth, or try praying in a way that you have not prayed before, or try giving up something that you cling to so tightly for your own personal sense of security. The idea is to disrupt the routine enough that you can start to think about, what is it that really helps me connect to God? And how do those things work out in my life? Because the problem is, nobody can tell you exactly what it is that's going to work best in your personal life to feel connection to God. Sometimes the only way you can discover that is to disrupt your routine, try a bunch of different things, find out what it is. And that's the kind of disruption that Jesus is always calling us to. Jesus is also calling us to the kind of disruption that challenges our ideas, that the way we've done things is the way we can always keep on doing it. Because increasingly, Christian communities, and our congregation too, have begun to revisit how we organize ourselves, how we grow in faith, how we pass on the faith to others. Because a lot of the things that we used to do and just figured, you just put the wheels in the rut and just keep on going, they're not working anymore. They're not working like they used to work. And they're not probably going to come back any more than VHS tapes. So what happens when the temples that we used to so rely on aren't there anymore? If the temple is gone, what do? Are we willing to re-envision how we live our life and how we have community together in ways that challenge us, but also open us up to being people of God in a new and different way that can go beyond simply the structures that we used to have? Ultimately, disruption is always hard, and it can be painful, and it can mean destruction of the ways that we have become comfortable with. In Jesus' day, the destruction of the temple that he spoke of meant the actual destruction of both the building and his own body. But new life came from that disruption. Jesus rose from the dead, and he gave people a new and living hope that really nobody had ever really envisioned or imagined could be possible. The Jews lost the temple, but they didn't die out. They found new ways to connect to God and to live as God's people. And that's also the hope we have whenever we face disruption. It can be painful. It can be hard. It is always confusing. But it is also full of hope. It's full of possibilities. And it's full of new life. Because whenever we open ourselves to the kind of disruptions that God is placing in our lives, God always has something new. Something that's full of hope. Something that's full of new beginnings. For us and for everybody in our world.